What is hell? I maintain it is the suffering of an inability to love. Fyodor Dostoevsky is known as a historic thinker on many, many topics. In his novels and articles, he discusses God, morality, nihilism, and existentialism. But today, I want to focus on an often neglected part of Dostoevsky's overall philosophy, his ideas about love. Because for this Russian author, love was a subject of endless fascination, and it crops up in almost every one of his works. Dostoevsky is adept at displaying how love can compel us to commit heinous, self-destructive actions, but also how it can redeem us, grant us meaning, and ultimately, even save the world. And if that's not a reason to keep watching, I don't know what is. Get ready to learn how love can kill, what passion has to do with politics, and why, for Dostoevsky, love was the fundamental redeeming quality of all humanity. As always, bear in mind this is just my interpretation of Dostoevsky and you are totally free to disagree. Also, there will be spoilers ahead for many of Dostoevsky's novels, though I will do my best to avoid giving too much away on major plot points. But with that out of the way, let's begin by exploring the darkest aspect of Dostoevsky's philosophy of love. What happens to us when we are deprived of it? 1. The unloving life is not worth living. The quote at the start of this video comparing hell to an inability to love comes from the elder Zosima in Dostoevsky's magnum opus, The Brothers Karamazov. According to him, the quickest and most potent way a human can plunge themselves into unimaginable torment is by cutting off their ability to love others. Deprived of this love, they will begin to fester like an infected wound as resentment, envy, and hatred fills the place where affection could have been. And nowhere is this more evident than in the character of the underground man. Famously, Dostoevsky's novella, Notes from the Underground, begins with the main character declaring himself sick, spiteful, and unattractive. And throughout his story, he narrates the various ways he sought to enhance the misery of other people. He vividly describes the sick pleasure he took in a toothache because he could make the lives of everyone around him that bit worse, with his loud and theatrical moans and complaints. He says that in his position as a civil servant, he would exercise his petty power on the people around him in a needlessly cruel manner. He would care nothing for the feelings of other people and would even go out of his way to make their lives worse just to savor their suffering. His entire philosophy can be summed up in the following phrase: "Let the world go to hell, but I should always have my tea." Of course, this philosophy is hardly a successful one, and the underground man ends up in profound misery as a result of it. The core of the underground man's suffering is that he has absolutely no fellow feeling for other people, and it is tragically understandable how he has become this way. To hear him tell it, he only has cruel and disloyal so-called friends, a meagre pension, and no reason to carry on living. In such a situation, it is easy to see how someone could lose their sense of love entirely. But this lack of love dooms him all the same. Ever eager to present complex psychological profiles, Dostoevsky shows how this aggressive spite eventually morphs into the underground man's way of punishing himself. Towards the end of the novella, he begins to befriend a poor and downtrodden prostitute named Liza, and it seems like there might be the first smatterings of genuine affection here. They have a long conversation where the underground man shocks her with his brutal and cruel honesty, but then briefly softens, inviting her to visit him at his home. But when she does appear and offers out a hand of friendship and companionship, he suddenly changes his tune, berating her and insulting her until she leaves. Now, he is not just unloving out of lack of opportunity, it has become a direct, self-harming choice. He soon regrets his cruelty and begins to run after Liza, but at the last moment, he decides it was better to spread his bitter resentment to another person. Now she will know the truth as well, that the world is not loving or kind, and it never will be. The hot brand of his insults will turn her against humanity as well, and a new underground man will be created, where before there was such promise of selflessness and redemption. The underground man has become so deep in his hatred of himself and the world that he does not know how to love anymore. It is like an atrophied muscle he has lost control over. And here we get potentially the saddest line in the entire story. Liza certainly did fully understand that I was a despicable man, and what was worse, incapable of loving her. The underground man is so torn apart inside with the insults and injustices of the world, and so unable to look past the malaise of his own self-hatred, that he is permanently deprived of love. Thus he dwells in a Dostoevskyan hell, mourning the loss of what could have made his life worthwhile. And when Dostoevsky equates lovelessness with hell, he is not talking merely about romantic love. Some of the happiest characters in his other novels are contented monastics, filled with a gentle love for everyone. But it is the all-encompassing, totalizing completeness of the underground man's hatred that dooms him. Because it is not just poor Liza he despises, it is all of mankind. Every indignity or suffering thrown at him becomes another twisted smile he can curl in the face of the next person he passes. He is the very definition of a hurt person hurting people. And he is also the starkest example of just how important love is in Dostoevsky's overall philosophy. For some thinkers, like Plato, love is a wonderful complement to a good life, but is ultimately subordinate to more important matters like virtue and the pursuit of truth. For others, like Nietzsche, interpersonal love is often looked down upon, with him remarking that very few great thinkers have ever been married. The Romantic poets often depicted love as a powerful, motivating and destabilizing force, throwing our souls into torment and ecstasy with every passing moment. But Notes from the Underground demonstrates that for Dostoevsky, love is not just powerful, not just valuable, but is an indispensable component of a worthwhile life. Without any love at all, no compassion for a partner or affection for a friend, or even a loose sense of commonality with the rest of the human race, we are doomed to be miserable and despise ourselves. To ask someone to live without loving others might as well be asking them to live without the use of oxygen. For those of you familiar with Buddhist philosophy, you might recognize some parallels here with the idea of loving kindness and the unskillful emotions. I also want to focus on Dostoevsky's choice to say that hell is the inability to love. He seems to agree with Aristotle here that the greater part of love is in the loving. It might be heartbreaking and isolating for us to feel that we are not loved, but to use this as a reason to never love others is to needlessly increase our suffering 100-fold. It is the genius of Dostoevsky to argue that our philosophies should begin with love, rather than getting to them further down the line. And Notes from the Underground is perhaps the darkest demonstration of this terrifying idea. And as we move forward to looking at some of the less savoury ways love can manifest, we should bear in mind that Dostoevsky thinks that a rejection of love entirely is the worst situation of all. This is why he equates lovelessness with hell. Abandoning our natural affection for other people dooms us entirely. It cannot get any worse than this. But anyway, enough of my gloomy rantings. We can now slowly move out of hell and begin to explore some of the ways Dostoevsky thinks the noble emotion of love can be morphed into something much uglier. How it can turn into a wish to control or to dominate, or otherwise bring out the most violent aspects of the human psyche. Let's look at the people who talk about love, but believe only in ego. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing to my channel or my Patreon. The links are in the description. 2. The love of the egoist. In modern parlance, the term narcissistic love has become pretty commonplace. Various definitions abound, but they all orbit around one key insight. Some lovers are only out for themselves. Knowingly or not, they aren't truly loving for the sake of those they love, but instead for some selfish benefit. This might be to plug some gap in their self-image, or from hedonistic desire, or simply out of spite. But however this manifests, Dostoevsky normally envisions it ending in disaster. And moreover, he sees this type of love everywhere in public life. Perhaps the most well-known example of this type of love is in the character of Luzhin from Crime and Punishment. Luzhin is a lawyer betrothed to marry Dunya, the sister of our protagonist Raskolnikov. Sorry, that's a lot of names to take in. However, it quickly becomes clear that Luzhin loves Dunya purely for the control he can exert over her. He talks about how he has always wished to marry a poor woman down on her luck, as this encourages her to remain constantly grateful to him for magnanimously agreeing to take her in just when she was least desirable. He thinks that women make much better wives, you see, when they cannot survive without their husbands. He becomes terrified when Dunya looks like she might come into some significant money because he does not really want to freely love and be loved freely in return. What he desires most is to control his beloved. Moreover, when he feels like he is losing this control, he turns spiteful and bitter, attempting to ruin Raskolnikov's reputation as a petty form of revenge. Today, we would probably not hesitate in calling Luzhin somewhat of a narcissist. Later, Dostoevsky would explore this ugly variant on love in even greater detail in his terrifying short story, The Meek One. Here, he portrays how a narcissistic and domineering husband mentally tortures his own wife until she eventually decides to end her life. Dostoevsky describes every inch of the man's control. He would deprive her of affection and have her beg it from him piece by piece. He would attempt to uncover dirt on her, so he always had something to hold above her head. Worst of all, he always presented things so he could hold the moral high ground and look down on her from it, not letting her forget a single one of her faults. Again, we see how a twisted and malformed version of love can manifest from a spiteful and controlling person. In this case, the egoist does not truly care about their beloved, but instead wants to see a glorified image of themselves reflected back at them. They want to prove that they are worthy of worship and affection, superior to everyone else around them, especially the one they are supposed to love. Both Luzhin and this husband manage to come across as simultaneously repulsive and deeply pitiable. They want selfless devotion, they want to be loved, but they refuse to give it themselves. As a result, rather than receiving the free affection of another agent, they must extract it bit by bit through numerous avenues of coercion. I would wager we all know people who love a little bit like this. For Dostoevsky, these people are also suffering from a certain inability to love. Though they are not quite in the living hell of the underground man, they are ultimately still cut off from true joy. And this begins a theme for Dostoevsky's philosophy. The more self-centered a love is, the less joy it can bring, both for the lover and the beloved. This will eventually culminate in him praising a semi-religious, selfless love. But we'll save that for later in the video. It is also worth noting that at points, both Luzhin and this husband express seemingly quite deep feelings of self-loathing. This continues the idea that Dostoevsky expressed in Notes from the Underground, how self-hatred can very quickly transform into a total lack of affection for anyone. Dostoevsky also explores how possessiveness in love can bring out its destructive and explosive dimensions. For instance, in The Brothers Karamazov, much of Dmitry Karamazov's suffering is caused by his lust-filled attachments to a woman named Grushenka. In an attempt to win her over, he betrays almost every one of his principles. He deceives his fiancée, spends other people's money, and beats his own father in a jealous rage. Though Dmitry's love is not outright narcissistic or manipulative, it is still possessive and envious. And without spoiling too much, this leads to pretty disastrous consequences. Likewise, in The Idiot, we see jealousy slowly drive the character of Rogozhin insane, and this culminates in a horrific and violent act against a woman who needed more than anything for someone to be kind to her. In both cases, it is not that these lovers set out to use the object of their affection egoistically. Instead, it is that their fear and their self-image got in the way. They may not have wanted to control, but they definitely wanted to possess. And Dostoevsky paints this drop of selfishness transforming pure love into something potentially violent and terrifying. To branch out from romantic examples, we also see Dostoevsky criticizing the intellectuals of his time period for their egoistic love of the people of Russia. Amongst the intelligentsia of his time, he saw that almost everyone would profess this deep affection for the poor and needy, but that this rarely extended to actually spending time with them and treating them as equals. Instead, much like the narcissistic lovers in his novels, the intellectual circles of St. Petersburg would insist that they already knew what the peasantry of Russia needed, and thought it was their job to enlighten them. Very few things seem to make Dostoevsky as angry as this condescending attitude. For him, behind all of these highfalutin words was a fundamental lack of respect for the traditions and way of life of the Russian peasantry, which in many ways Dostoevsky thought was superior to the westernized academic circles of the cities. This thought culminates in his astonishing novel Demons, where he skewers the members of the intelligentsia as fundamentally self-interested. He accuses them of really just wanting to use whatever sentiments they deem necessary to gain control and power, and of thinking they knew how the peasantry should live their lives better than they did. Here, we also begin to see another theme in Dostoevsky's view on love. He not only views it as of extreme interpersonal significance, but it also becomes a key part of his wider philosophical and political views as time goes on. The idea we see running through all of the examples of this section is that love can become corrupted through a sense of superiority and a lack of respect for the agency of the beloved. And this makes sense given the particulars of Dostoevsky's religious views. For him, part of what made Christ's love for mankind so moving is that he was fully human. He was not a spirit standing above us dictating orders, but instead suffering alongside us and delivering his message as a God-made man. I am not Christian myself, but I don't think you have to be to see the beauty in this idea. Dostoevsky constantly points out how our desire for love can mingle with our fears and insecurities to create this noxious mixture of condescension and control, and that this threatens to strangle what could have been a joyous kind of love. This poisoning of kindness and affection by a wish to control also forms the backbone of much of his critiques of other religious movements. For instance, Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, and even some Orthodox churches. And I think this warning is worth listening to for our own lives. How often do we taint our own love with some form of egoism or selfishness? Sure, we might not be total narcissists or believe that we are fundamentally superior to our partner, but how often do we think we love someone for who they are, only for it to emerge later that we may have partly loved them for what they could do for us? It is a difficult question to pose, but one well worth asking when something as important as love is on the table. But then this also begs the question, how do we love in a way that is not so egoistic? Well, Dostoevsky has a surprising answer. 3. Love and sacrifice. In the 14th century, the English mystic Julian of Norwich fell ill with a fever and began to experience visions. A devout Christian, she experienced revelations about the passion Jesus felt for humanity as he died on the cross, sacrificing himself to save our souls. In one of these visions, Christ tells her, "It is endless satisfaction to me that I ever suffered passion for thee, and if I might suffer more, I would suffer more." The phrasing here is incredibly important. For Julian, Christ did not just suffer because it was necessary. He did so as a loving and willing act of self-sacrifice. So great was his devotion to mankind that he was not only able to bear suffering for us, but was glad to do so. Just like how you will often hear parents not just say that they would die for their children, but that they would do so without a hint of regret or resentment in their hearts. Again, I am not personally religious, but I have had this line running through my head for months now, because it is one of the most insightful meditations on selfless love I have ever come across. And it also summarizes in a single sentence what Dostoevsky thinks the purest kind of affection can amount to. A key theme in many of Dostoevsky's later works is the idea of loving through sacrifice. This forms a very clear contrast from the egoistic kind of love we explored in the previous section. Whereas the selfish lover attempts to extract from their beloved, the sacrificial lover intends to give themselves over to them, as if as an offering. Obviously, such a move is fraught with danger, and despite praising this sort of sacrificial love, Dostoevsky does not shy away from how it can end horribly. Arguably, his novel The Idiot is all about how a kind man who loves in a wholehearted and selfless way is driven mad by the cruel and cowardly behavior of other people. The titular character, Prince Myshkin, spends much of the novel attempting to help the fallen woman, Nastasia Filipova, and her troubled and reckless lover, Rogozin. Sorry if I've completely butchered the pronunciations there. More than anything else, he wants them to see their own value, bring them out of their cynicism, and love them. He even sacrifices his prospects with the woman he truly wants to be with to achieve this, and forgives Rogozin's murder attempt on him. And yet, in the end, it is all in vain. I won't totally spoil it here, but suffice to say, the innocent Prince Myshkin's attempts blow up in his face, and he is left a broken man, sent abroad for extensive medical treatment in an attempt to recover his psyche. He gave all he had in acts of selfless love, and yet Dostoevsky paints him as suffering for it. The question dangling in the air is, should he have been so kind? Should he have been so loving? And Dostoevsky's answer is still unequivocally Yes. We get a glimpse of the true radicalism of his loving philosophy here. He implores us to love others selflessly even as it's going horribly wrong for us. For him, this is what it truly means to be self-sacrificial in our love. And let's be absolutely clear, this is a tall order the great Russian is asking us to perform, and it leaves us incredibly vulnerable to exploitation and manipulation. But as we shall see in the next section, his demands only become more extreme. We see a similar kind of selfless love in the character of Alyosha in the Brothers Karamazov. He is the most spiritual of the three brothers, and his most remarkable trait is his complete unwillingness to judge other people or consider them beneath him in any way. All throughout the novel, he encounters people who have done terrible things, pursued selfish ends, and committed only scant acts of kindness in their lives. And yet, each time, despite all the good he is doing in the world, he will continually affirm that he is not better than them. Instead, he shows them an unrelenting and indiscriminate kind of love. This comes out most strongly in his meeting with Grushenka, another of Dostoevsky's fallen women. Despite her poor reputation and lowly societal position, Alyosha will not consider himself superior to her, and indeed, at points even acts as if he is beneath her. Confronted with genuine egalitarian affection and understanding, Grushenka's spirits are restored, and she actually begins to change as a person for the better. He does the same thing for many others over the course of the story. Alyosha will take someone who has been made cruel by self-judgment or the judgment of others, and he will extend a hand to them. But this is not the condescending wish to save that Dostoevsky was so critical of in the previous section. This is instead a genuine brotherly love that emanates from Alyosha like an aura. This is the ideal sort of love for Dostoevsky. Endless, uncondescending, and selfless. And he admits that this is incredibly demanding. In the same novel, the elder Zosima, a much-regarded monastic, talks about the difference between active love and a kind of dreamy love. Whereas it is easy for anyone to fantasize about grand romantic gestures or a general affection for mankind, or to say that they love someone from the bottom of their heart, active love is different and much more difficult. Zosima admits that it is harsh and dreadful and requires labor and fortitude. It is the kind of love that is willing to give and give and give without a hint of resentment or entitlement. I would argue we see this kind of love in small ways everywhere, from the grandfather who painfully kneels on brittle bones to play with his delighted granddaughter, to the wife standing by her husband as he's ravaged with illness. It is in the eyes of the dog who leaps to the defense of their owner, and in the last breath of the soldier taking a bullet for their friend. But to have this active love be the guiding force of your life, to be totally devoted to others, willing to sacrifice anything for them, and actively loving them every second of every day, that is the sort of love Zosima and Dostoevsky demand of us. And at points, he says it is the highest virtue a person can have. It is the cornerstone of Dostoevsky's faith, and he finds its apotheosis in the image of Christ dying for us all, still crying out for his captors to be forgiven. And all throughout Dostoevsky's novels, we see the redeeming power of being loved like this. In Crime and Punishment, it is the selfless and noble love of Sonia that helps Raskolnikov rediscover his ailing conscience and become a better man. In The Idiot, it is what convinces Nastasia Filipova, if only for a moment, that she might have worth as a person. And in The Brothers Karamazov, Alyosha's love consistently transforms the people around him from callous and uncaring to kind and generous. For Dostoevsky, this is what makes selfless love worthwhile, even when it leaves us vulnerable and sometimes goes disastrously wrong. For him, it has the power to cut through people's insecurity and self-destruction and make them see that they are worthy of respect, and reveal to them the kind of person that they could be if they truly tried. One of the wonderful things about Dostoevsky's novels is that almost no one is portrayed as beyond redemption, and everyone has the potential to become something truly good, if only they had this treasured kind of love. No doubt such a love is incredibly rare, but if even a fraction of what Dostoevsky says about its transformative effects are true, it may be well worth striving for. But if you thought that this was a stretch, Dostoevsky's demands are about to get much more extreme, because now he wants us to take this selfless, sacrificial, almost sacramental love and expand it to encompass the whole of humanity. 4. The universal lover. In ancient Greece, people would use the word agape to describe the sort of universal divine love that Christians would later attribute to God. This was part of a whole set of different types of loving that included eros, or erotic love, and philia, or brotherly love. And Dostoevsky's radical suggestion is that we bring about a world in which there is universal agape and philia. That is, affection and brotherly love for all. He himself seems to recognize that this idea is a little bit ambitious. He even calls one of his final short stories exploring this idea The Dream of a Ridiculous Man. Here, he explores someone going through a brief but intense existential crisis, who emerges on the other side with a completely new outlook on life. The man discovers a wish to work tirelessly in service to a future where we all love one another selflessly and openly, saying that this will be the salvation of the world. And of course, everyone else calls him ridiculous. There are many theological themes that come up in Dostoevsky. There's the problem of evil, the issue of morality without God, and so much more. But one that perhaps appears more often than any other is the doctrine of loving your neighbor as yourself. And this becomes increasingly prominent in his later writings. In The Brothers Karamazov, the elder Zosima gives us perhaps the closest approximation of Dostoevsky's own philosophy. He says that we should love life and encourage all others to do the same. And moreover, that this must be the energetic, active love that we spoke about in the previous section. We must behave like Alyosha and seek to serve those around us as if they were our brothers. Essentially, Dostoevsky wants us to emulate the behaviors of the previous section, but not just towards our friends or our partners, but anyone that we come across. And moreover, to do all of this not begrudgingly or churlishly, but with endless enthusiasm and energy, and even gratitude. This also goes some way to making sense of what Dostoevsky means when he says we are not just responsible for our own sin, but also the sins of everyone else. He is encouraging us to treat the hardship of life like a shared burden, and to extend empathy and compassion towards anyone suffering, even if that suffering is of their own creation, and to recognize we're doing this not from a place of superiority, but because it is a privilege to serve. This also explains how Dostoevsky can portray characters like the underground man with such exquisite tenderness, while still not pretending that they are not responsible for their actions. Dostoevsky is doing in a literary way what Jesus or Alyosha do in a literal way. He is sharing in the trials and tribulations of his characters without removing their agency. And through his writings, he encourages us to do the same to people suffering in our own lives. It is a little bit like Schopenhauer's idea that we are a community of fellow sufferers. Dostoevsky wants us to recognize the pain of other people and extend our compassion even to those who are cruel or self-destructive. And this attitude closely aligns with Dostoevsky's wider philosophy. In a speech delivered a year before his death in celebration of the poet Pushkin, Dostoevsky discusses his vision for the future of Russia and the world. Just as Prince Mishkin or Alyosha or Christ serve as examples to light our way to selflessness and universal kindness, he wanted Russia itself to become a symbol of universal global brotherhood, saying, "To become a Russian fully means only to become a brother of all men, to become, if you will, a universal man." Dostoevsky's ridiculous dream is of a future of love between all people, where we are all a bit more like Alyosha, Mushkin, and Christ, where we would take up the demands of a totalizing, active, and universal love and follow it to the ends of the earth. He is perhaps one of the only authors in history to take the Christian commandment to love all people so seriously. For Dostoevsky, violence and resentment and retribution would never get to the root of the problems we face as a species. He thought that instead of leading by conquest or military might, a brighter future could be brought about by examples of selfless people, saying, "Our destiny is universality, won not by the sword, but by the strength of brotherhood and our fraternal aspiration to reunite mankind." This, again, makes a lot of sense given Dostoevsky's religion. For him, the most impactful person in history was Jesus Christ. He accomplished more than any general, transformed the face of much of the world, and yet did so through the power of his message of total love. Sure, this idea has been corrupted and used for all sorts of nefarious ends, but Dostoevsky still believes, hopes, and dreams that we might be able to recapture it. Viewed in this light, some of Dostoevsky's characters like Zosima, Alyosha, Mishkin, and more can form powerful examples for us to follow. Personally, I find that part of the power of great literature is that it lends a certain dignity to ways of living. When we are struggling to follow our own values, we can turn to a literary character we admire and ask what they would do, and suddenly we don't feel so much like a fool. I have certainly noticed this myself. When I am struggling to be kind, or when it seems to be backfiring on me, I quite often call to mind the humble Alyosha, or the poor and loving Prince Myshkin, and it certainly helps soothe my burgeoning resentment. It helps me realize that love is not stupid or ridiculous. It might not always go our way, and there are plenty of kind people that get taken advantage of. But in my very limited experience, it remains infinitely better than the cynical alternative. I still have a long way to go to live up to even a minuscule fraction of this kind of love, but I'm eternally grateful to have these characters to help me on my way. But whoever we are, cynic or optimist, religious or atheist, we can certainly learn a lot from this extraordinary Russian thinker. And who knows? Maybe he's right. Maybe love truly can save the world. Because, to quote the New Testament that Dostoevsky valued so much, love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. I have to admit, I don't know if Dostoevsky is right, but I can say, I really hope he is. And if you want to explore more of Dostoevsky's philosophy, then click here to see my analysis of perhaps his most famous work, Crime and Punishment. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.